Thanks, Mark, for reading. Please keep our Bibles open in John chapter 11. And may I add my own welcome to the family and friends of Hannah Silk with us this afternoon. And it's right, isn't it, that we have thanked God for Hannah. Hannah is a wonderful example of what God is like. God gives life like no one else. He alone has the power and the authority to create life out of nothing and to give life like that. That's what he does. And in these last few weeks in John's Gospel, we have seen what happens when this giver of life walks on our earth. Because here in John 11, we've been following Jesus. It started, didn't it, when he heard that his friend Lazarus was ill. And then he travelled down to Bethany near Jerusalem. And when he got there, Lazarus' corpse had been in that tomb for 4 days. We saw Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And come out is what Lazarus did. Death is defeated. At last, here in Jesus is one who can undo death and bring and give life. What do you do with a man like that? Well, you want him dead. What is for the best for Jesus? His death. It's shocking, isn't it, that that is what some in Jesus' day thought was for the best. But today in our passage we'll see there's something even more shocking, maybe. Jesus' friends, his followers, including today, looking back, would now say they are convinced that the very best thing that could have happened to Jesus, this Jesus, was that he died. Well, our third installment here in John 11, this is a chapter all about resurrection and life from Jesus, but now the focus narrows down very sharply on his death. It's the only way actually to make sense of this whole chapter. We must understand why Jesus had to die. We must grasp that the only reason chapter 11 is true, the only reason Jesus can give life to the world is because he died. And so we will end up seeing Jesus' death is good news. Let's pick up the account at verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. Well, I guess this is no surprise, is it, given what's just happened? There is a walking, talking Lazarus around the place in their midst. They knew not long beforehand, decomposing in that tomb. So here is compelling evidence. Jesus was sent by the Father. They believed in him. But not everyone responds like that. Verse 46. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs." Now notice, here we have Jesus' enemies, but they cannot deny what he's been up to. There he is, Lazarus, on the loose. And this is no one-off. They even admit Jesus performed many signs. Well, today, don't they? People claim that if they saw miracles like in Jesus' day, of course they'd believe in him. Well, would they? And if not, why not? Well, let's read on and see what we find. Well, in view of all they've seen Jesus doing, they ask that question here in verse 47. What are we to do? So in light of all Jesus has been doing, what is for the best? How should they respond? And that is a question for all of us. When it comes to this Jesus of John 11, what is for the best? And in that passage we'll see two answers. And the first comes from these religious leaders. They conclude that what's for the best is the death of Jesus. Well, the problem facing these religious leaders is set out there in verse 48. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So you can see the logic. It's pretty good, isn't it? If Jesus keeps doing these things, well, people will realize here is God's Son, and they'll trust in him, which means, according to Jesus, they'll receive resurrection and life. Surely that is the most amazing news, the great outcome that we all want. Well, not everyone. They're very nervous, aren't they? Because the way they see it is that if many people start believing in Jesus, then the Romans, who are the occupying power at the time, would take away, first of all, their place, by which they're referring to the temple, and then also the nation. And although they don't say it explicitly, they'd be out of a job and would have lost the status and authority that they had. Then we meet Caiaphas, and now he is high priest. He's top dog, if you like, both religiously and politically. He's got a solution. Verse 49. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." It's remarkable, isn't it, how low Caiaphas' view is of those around him. He says, "You know nothing at all," with the obvious implication that thankfully he is there, who of course knows best. And he's a politician. He doesn't quite come out and say it straight, does he? But it's obvious what he has in mind. Jesus must die. Of course he would say, granted, in usual circumstances, we wouldn't want to do this. No, it's not an ideal solution. Avoid it if at all possible. But, says Caiaphas, it can't be helped. For the sake of the people and the nation, he must die. He says that would be better for you that way. I don't know if you watch House of Cards. Caiaphas, if you like, is the President Frank Underwood. He is in authority. He claims to be serving the good of the people. But we know exactly what's going on. He's serving number one, ruthlessly protecting and advancing his own interests. Jesus must die. Ask people today, do you want to kill Jesus? Good gracious, no. Why would I ever want to? No, not at all. Ask people today, are you happy for Jesus to have the authority over every part of your life? Are you happy that what Jesus says goes, that he knows best, and you will trust him with it? Yes, we'd say we wouldn't kill Jesus, but of course today you don't have to. Today people find all sorts of very respectable ways of, keeping Jesus at arm's length, keeping him away from those parts of my life that I'd prefer to cling on to for myself. Thank you very much. So which is better for you when it comes to Jesus? And that others won't be slow in offering you advice. Your parents, of course, go to church, great, but just don't overdo it. Remember all we've done for you. They'll be the boss. Oh yes, do what you like in your own time if that helps, wonderful, but just be careful in the office. Remember, you do need to be a team player. You don't want to jeopardize all you've worked so hard for. Even to the Christian leader or the small group leader, maybe just leave that issue for now. Don't speak up. You'll lose the influence that you have got. I wonder, do we think, yes, of course I like the Jesus of John chapter 11, and I'll have as much of him as I can, as long as it doesn't put my comfort or my status, my popularity, my life at risk. As we read John 11, it's striking, isn't it? Caiaphas' plotting comes immediately after what has happened at the tomb and Lazarus coming out from the dead. And that contrast is meant to underline for us reading today, how ridiculous is this? Here is one defeated death, promises life to any and all who believe in him, and yet Caiaphas wants rid of him. But it is, we're meant to realize, just as foolish today when we stand back from giving wholehearted commitment to this Jesus because we are worried of what other people might think or of what it might cost us. What else are we clinging to that we're so afraid of losing when Jesus has shown us this life-giving authority even over death? So Caiaphas plots. Was his plot successful? Did his scheming achieve its ends? Well, up to a point, he did get Jesus killed. But we can look back and ask, but what happened to that temple, to that nation he was so keen to protect? Well, not long after Jesus, a horrific war with the Romans led to the temple being destroyed and the nation was no more. But again, think what that might look like today. We resist Jesus. We think life might be better my way. We expend all this energy pursuing our ambitions, not a few compromises along the way. But where does it get us in the end? Even in this life, all too often, isn't it? It's frustration and tears and failure. And even should we succeed in some small measure, it comes to nothing. It's the subject of this chapter again, death. It mocks all those worldly ambitions. We try to keep hold of our lives, we'll have to let go one day. Death will have the final word outside of Jesus. So what is for the best? Caiaphas, like many today, convinced life without Jesus. But in these verses there is another view. What is for the best? And again, it is the death of Jesus. Now we're meant to realize as we read this that Jesus' death was not Caiaphas' idea, however clever he thought he was. Even in chapter 11 we've seen, haven't we, this plot has hardly come out of the blue. Do you remember when Jesus first heard of Lazarus' illness, he decided to go to Bethany? His disciples immediately took fright, reminded him that was a dangerous move given what had happened there recently. But you see, this death has been on the agenda throughout. It's been hanging over all that has happened. We're meant to see the raising of Lazarus and the death of Jesus as connected. The two go together. But the question is how? So yes, wicked men plotted the death of Jesus and they got their way. But there is far, far more going on than that. Now, Caiaphas was high priest. The high priest's rightful role was to be a spokesman for God. And so it turns out that here, in what he says, he does speak the truth. He tells us the significance of Jesus' death, although he was unaware of it. But here he gives us God's account of why Jesus had to die. Verse 51. Caiaphas did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So we need to think carefully, how are we to understand this death of Jesus? And here it is opened up for us. First, it is one man for the people. Do you remember what Caiaphas had said back in verse 50? Better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. And Caiaphas was right, profoundly right. For believers in Jesus, it is much better for us that Jesus would die, because his death was for the people. But what does this mean? And here we must dig to find out, because it's clearly so important. And John's Gospel so far has led us to ask, what is the greatest problem that you and I face? Take Caiaphas. He should have known better, but it's clear he thinks it's the Romans. He thinks it's his standing, and so protecting such things. That's his greatest issue that has to be resolved. I wonder what our greatest concern is that occupies our mind, our energies, our thoughts. For our world, it is the career. It is those money issues, the relationship or the lack of it. It's our children's prospects, or like Caiaphas, our social standing. But then we read chapter 11 of John and we're reminded death. We all face death. And here's a fundamental issue that we are confronted with, however much we try and push it out of our minds, because it brings to the fore our relationship with our Creator. And in verse 50, we're given a reminder of the problem. It is that we would perish. Now you may remember that's not the first time we've heard that word in John's Gospel. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. That's our default. We are heading to perish. The world, humanity, has turned its back on God. That is what it deserves. Without Jesus, the world is condemned. The wrath of God, we've been told, his anger remains on us and one day will be poured out. On that day, we'll be separated from God, from all that is good, forever. Nothing we can do about it. That is our greatest problem, our deepest need, as we come to John 11 and we read this account. And of all people, again, Caiaphas should have known this. In fact, the Old Testament, the sacrificial system over which he presided at the temple, which he has spoken about, well, that sacrificial system was there, given by God, to underline the seriousness of sin, to show us that it deserves death, to show us that to approach a holy God, well, a sacrifice is required. Sin must be taken away. So in that sacrificial system, the sin and the guilt of the worshipper was transferred to the animal, and the animal would die. It's a substitution, a swap. The animal would die in place of the worshipper. And in this sacrificial system is pointing to the solution, this substitution, one dying for another. But the sacrificial system wasn't the solution itself, because the blood of bull and goat could never take away human sin. And with that in mind, we then hear Caiaphas' words and realize what is being said. Verse 50, one man should die for the people. Verse 51, Jesus would die for the nation. That word for is all important. Jesus was to die for, in the place of, on behalf of, instead of the people, the nation. So let's draw those threads and put them together. What happened when Jesus died? Well, sin deserves death. But Jesus had no sin of his own. He is perfectly innocent. But he went to that cross to stand in our place as this substitute, this swap. Because Jesus died, the penalty is paid. That wrath, that anger of God is poured out, not on us, but on him. As Jesus cried at the cross, it is finished. Jesus gave his life once and for all, that any who trust in him would receive life from him. Now that understanding of Jesus' death is far from popular today. Richard Dawkins, in his book The God Delusion, says this: I have described atonement, the central doctrine of Christianity, as vicious, sadomasochistic and repellent. We should also dismiss it as barking mad, but for its ubiquitous familiarity, which has dulled our objectivity. Well, Dawkins gets one thing right there, that Jesus' death is at the heart of biblical Christianity. That is true. But from what he thinks he's understood of it, he finds it deeply offensive, as do many others. And it's not just those outside the church looking in. We will find many professing Christians, many church leaders who would deny this. The clear teaching of John 11 that Jesus died as a substitute for others. Well, here in verse 51, notice what we are told about Caiaphas. He is prophesying. That is, this is God speaking. So this is God's idea about Jesus' death. God's plan, God's view. It was there in all of the Old Testament. It's been there in John's Gospel so far, all preparing us to see that God gave his Son to this death, because without this death for others, we would be lost forever, without hope. So this view of Jesus' death is biblical. It's necessary. But more than that, we are to see this is glorious. This is where we see our God for who he truly is and what he is really like. On Wednesday evening in Charleston, in South Carolina, that gunman took aim at an 87-year-old Susie Jackson. Seeing that, 26-year-old Tywanza Jackson threw himself between the gunman and his great aunt, and he took a volley of bullets and died. As it turns out, so did his great aunt. But hearing of Tywanza's actions, they move us, don't they? We see the wonder of one who would sacrificially lay down their life for another. Well, we in the world have treated our Creator appallingly. We resist God. We love the darkness. We hate the light. Even though everything we have is a gift from our Creator, we've personally rejected him. We've declared that we know better, that we're better off without him. We deserve this condemnation that is coming our way. And yet, God did not give up on the world. He sent his only Son into the world, and a Son full of grace and truth. Jesus came in truth because God's justice matters. God's honor has to be upheld. The punishment due to sin must be paid. Jesus came full of truth, but he also came full of grace. That is, with the overflowing kindness of God to those who simply do not deserve it. Jesus came into the world in love, carrying with him in his person this gift of life for us. It was a gift with an almost unbearably high price tag. He came to take the hit for us. He died for his people, for us. And because he did that, our eternity has changed for the infinitely better forever. As we look to Jesus' death on the cross, we see our glorious, life-giving, self-giving God doing that for us. And with that then, the result of Jesus' death was to gather the scattered children of God. Verse 52 again, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So those religious leaders professing concern for the nation of Israel, although obviously much more self-centered in truth. God, on the other hand, had a genuine and deep concern for his people Israel. And yet his concern burst far wider than that. He promised his blessings would overflow to all. And it's Jesus' death that brings these benefits to the nations. Jesus himself put it like this, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. The language here of scattering reminds us of the previous chapter. Jesus, the good shepherd. We were told there that the sheep were scattered. They were under threat. And seeing the danger, the shepherd, because he's the good shepherd, doesn't hang back. No, Jesus put himself between the sheep and the danger. So much so, this shepherd laid down his life for the sheep. The shepherd becoming the lamb who takes away the sin of the world. And because of that death, the shepherd can now gather the sheep into safety. The shepherd calls out for his sheep, and they hear his voice. That was Lazarus. He heard the voice of the shepherd, even dead in the tomb. But Jesus didn't come just for Lazarus. He came for the Jews, his own people, but not only for the Jews. Because this shepherd has sheep that were not of that original Jewish sheepfold. He will bring all his sheep in to make the one flock, drawing all people to himself. Now, do you remember again Caiaphas' view that unless Jesus was dealt with, he said there'd be no place. He said there'd be no temple, no meeting place between heaven and earth, God and humanity. And with that, he said, unless we deal with Jesus, no nation, no people of God. Now, we've already seen how Caiaphas was wrong, wasn't he? In that despite killing Jesus, the Romans did come and take away the temple and the land. But Caiaphas, who says that others know nothing at all, actually turns out to be doubly wrong. Because it turns out there is a temple still today. A new temple, a better temple. Jesus, because of his death, is a place where sinful humanity can meet with the holy God and know him. And with that, Jesus brings to God a people. Not merely that one nation, but a great multitude from every tribe and language and tongue. And wonderfully, we see that in a small but amazing way here this afternoon. We are very different, a range of backgrounds, personalities. We were scattered from one another, most of all from God, lost without him. But now, through Jesus and his death, we have found forgiveness. We have been given life. We've been united into one people, drawn to God and to one another by the cross of the Lord Jesus. Well, as we conclude now our series we've had in John 10 and 11, look again at the verses at the heart of this chapter, verse 25. Jesus said to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Jesus is issuing each of us with a challenge. Do you believe this? You are being put on the spot right now. You cannot avoid this question. If someone asks you to marry them, or if someone held out to you £1 million and says, it's yours if you take it, you have to respond. You have to do something. To supposedly do nothing is, in both of those cases, to refuse the offer and the one making the offer. Jesus says to you, do you believe this? Now, he's raised Lazarus from the dead. He has given us compelling evidence. He really is the resurrection and the life. Because of that, Caiaphas asked this question, what are we to do? Well, what are we to do? What is better for us? Do we think it is better for us to resist Jesus? That is, do we still think, in the end, the good life comes from me, from within, from my efforts, from this world? I'll get it there. That Jesus' resurrection and life is not worth having. Well, it just makes life too complicated. It would cost me. Maybe we maintain a veneer of Christian respectability, but deep down we are saying, no thanks. Well, sideline Jesus, reject him, refuse to believe. Jesus has told us where that will end. You will perish. Or have we realized the wonderful news that here in John's Gospel we meet one who was sent into our world by the Father with this gift for us of what we could not get for ourselves. And we realize that, of course, it's obvious. It is better for me, for you, to simply believe in him as I must and receive from him this life that he gives. Yes, I can see Jesus is the resurrection and the life. He died that I could enjoy that. He took my place, died my death. He exhausted the wrath of God so that I may have life, abundant life, knowing this glorious Jesus now and into eternity. What is best for us? Let's pray as we close. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. Father, we praise you for the life that Jesus gives. Thank you that to give this life to us, Jesus went willingly to his death in our place, dealing with our sin to bring us to you. And thank you, this is not just for us, but for all the world, that at the cross the nations see your glory revealed and are drawn together to you. Amen.